collaboration between the World Trade Center Barcelona, Boston, Leeuwarden, and Washington, D.C., all part of the World Trade Center Association's international network, which consists of over 320 trade centers and represents over 90 countries worldwide, providing an international trade ecosystem of global connections for all its members. We are delighted to see so many of our colleagues and friends tuning in today from all countries around the world. During this uncertain time, together we can truly make a difference in trade. Thank you all for attending. My name is Carolyn Jepson, and I head up the Marketing Communications Department for the World Trade Center Boston and WebPort Global. To give you a brief overview, WebPort Global is an online platform that focuses on facilitating international trade for SMEs, providing connections and opportunities throughout the world. We are pleased to be hosting this session in conjunction with Qwyk and Simpliship. Now I have the privilege of introducing our speakers. Joining us from the Netherlands is Martyn Verhaegen, the CEO and founder of Qwyk. Martyn launched Qwyk in 2017 with the objective of helping logistics companies leverage the benefits of new technology. With a global customer base, Qwyk is at the forefront of supporting digital transformation in the freight and logistics sectors. Joining us from the US is Cory Margand, the CEO and co-founder of Simpliship. At the intersection of logistics and technology, Simpliship is focused on creating products that amplify machine scale communications and industry-leading expertise required to keep pace in today's rapidly evolving supply chain. Just a quick few notes before we begin. We will be recording this session. If you please keep your mics on mute during the presentation and send your questions via the chat button, those questions will be answered throughout the session. Now, without further ado, let's start our virtual fireside chat with our experts, Martyn and Cory. First, could you each tell us, our audience, a little about your companies and how you have worked together to change how international logistics shipping services are procured? Martyn?
Sure thing. So my name is Martyn. I run Qwyk since 2017, as you mentioned. And we basically provide a platform for freight forwarders. So we call a digital freight forwarder out of the box for them to go online and digitize some of the business processes that they have with their customers. So shippers can interact with the freight forwarder about quotes or about booking, shipments, track and trace, all that kind of stuff. And we work with Cory and Simpliship, basically making the rates and the quotation part of that happen. So we're fully integrated there.
Great.
Yeah, so in addition to the rate management API that we work very closely with the Qwyk team on, we're also an international air and ocean freight marketplace. And that's how we started in 2014, roughly. And our goal is really pretty simple for a complex task, is to basically match shippers that are trying to get rates and book shipments with either their own set of freight forwarders or our network of freight forwarders. And it's very simple. We're trying to cut time out and that cost for shippers. And then on the forwarder side, it was the first step into selling digitally for forwarders. So our job is to bring them business. And as you see, everything in B2B is going digital, and there's transactions happening online. We also license our API to, other transportation management systems where, typically speaking, they've been mostly domestic focused, or B2B marketplaces where buyers and sellers are meeting online to buy and sell stuff. Our API offers them international freight solution as well.
That's great. Now, of course, the global pandemic is on everyone's mind, causing people to be hesitant to invest during this uncertain time. How should businesses refocus to achieve success? Cory?
Yeah, thanks. My personal opinion is that, and it hasn't actually changed too much pre-COVID either. Actually, it's always been about data for me. And so what I mean by this is I come from the BCO or shipper side, and it's always been very hard to get whatever you want at that point. Like if I want to get a rate, it takes a while to get rates if it's not a contracted rate, or evaluate suppliers and stuff like this. And I think if anything, COVID's probably made that even or hyping that issue really so much. And I think, in my perspective, is investing in tech is going to be the way to go. And I think international logistics, generally speaking, has been a little bit behind the rest of the supply chain. In 14 years when I first started on the BCO side, there was a lot of focus on technology when it came to ERPs and enterprise resource planning. and also supplier portals and how to interact with your supplier, how to get that data downstream. But to be quite frank and honest, there's been very limited investment, prior on the logistics side. So I think you'll see more investment on technology, TMS, how to basically manage some of the issues we're going to talk about today in real time, versus reacting, unfortunately, which is, COVID's brought to light.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
fully agree with that. I mean, Cory calls it data. I tend to call it communication. I mean, what we've seen over the past couple of months is that that's gotten at various points heavily disrupted. You've got people now all of a sudden needing to work from home, not being in the office, not having access to their company phone or sometimes even their company networks, right? And really what it emphasizes is that availability needs to be there. I mean, that we need to socially distance and work from home doesn't mean that everything else can stop, as everybody will know. So a lot of the focus for me is, I think, especially in when we've been talking to customers and prospective customers, and how can we sort of ensure that communication, that accessibility keeps going. Because if you want to ship something and you can't reach that person by phone, I mean, you got to get that price or that quotation or the tracking status of that shipment somehow, right? And that's really what we're also trying to help with in terms of these businesses.
Great, thank you. Of course, we are all hoping that the vaccine for COVID-19 will soon be approved and ready for distribution. This will require supply chain collaboration. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so examples of this really is I think the air freight industry, generally speaking. So prior to COVID, we were, at least on the US from China side, we were at like $3 a kilo or something like that. Now during COVID, we went up to, 18, 20 a kilo, and for various reasons, right? So passenger planes were taken or grounded or repurposed for cargo, because you've got passenger planes and cargo where you're putting freight inside. If you take some of that out of the market, you're removing that capacity. So now we've got other launches like iPhone, et cetera. And to be quite honest, the vaccine is probably going to be one of the biggest launches of all time. So I obviously have very big concerns over air freight capacity and the ability to actually distribute these all around the world. I mean, we're not just talking about the US, we're talking about globally. And there's only so much capacity that's available. And so speed to market is going to be an issue. I mean, it's all going to be timing. It'll be certainly interesting to see what happens in the near future, I think.
Martyn?
Yeah, I can, speak a little bit towards Europe, but I know it's slightly different probably in the US, but we're also going to see governments obviously getting heavily involved in this, right? And it's not something you usually see happen with like an iPhone launch or anything. Governments, I think, over the past couple of months have been propping up airlines, and you can say that's maybe incidental or accidental to some extent. But I think a lot of those governments were expecting they're going to need capacity at some point, so they're going to have to get a virus distributed and made accessible. I think in general, first world, second world, we're going to be probably fine in terms of the distribution. I think the critical part is going to be getting into the middle of the desert in Africa or rainforest in South America or like the inland of India. Right? Those are people that today or even before have already been difficult to reach to a lot of extent. And now you're dealing with something that's 8 times sensitive and temperature controlled and climate controlled and all of those things, which will make it all the more, all the more challenging, sort of on micro level.
Right. Absolutely. The next question I have is, can you explain how this crisis can be turned into a big opportunity for businesses? How can they reinvent themselves?
Yeah, I alluded to this earlier in terms of the communication, right? I mean, you've got companies that sort of really picked up and said, we're going to do things different and more digital. We're going to make sure that those lines of communication stay open between us and our customers. And we're going to actually show that we can do it better than we even did before, because now we're forced to. We don't have an excuse to put that digitization project on the back burner anymore. We actually need it right now. So there's businesses leveraging those opportunities and actually deciding to do this now rather than putting it off, which you see some of the more risk-averse people do. And there's them reinventing themselves. It's reinventing parts of the process, right? I think especially in logistics, they're not all of a sudden doing something completely different, about how they're moving cargo, but they're making themselves more accessible. They're making it easier. They're becoming more digitized, more structured, and I think that's kind of, to some extent, in the long term, pay off. There's those companies that take the risk now, once this stuff hopefully settles down in a couple of months, maybe a year, they'll still be picking the fruits. Whereas the ones that have sort of left behind, that barely made it through this crisis, they're going to have the hard time going forward as well. Because a part of it is risk management, and we'll see now that you need to have that accessibility and these digital solutions also to manage these kinds of risks as they come up.
So true. Cory?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I'm going to harp on this, but technology really is the only solution to a lot of the stuff that BCOs, shippers face. So, I can tell you, I started off as a global logistics coordinator for Adidas, and I had forwarders, carriers, of course, calling on me, trying to get face-to-face meetings nonstop. And so that's not, the real problem with that is it's frustrating for the BCO, but the real problem is that the forwarder carrier isn't getting business, and they're not going to get business for a long time from that person that they're just calling on. It takes years. And even, that door revolves and there's a new person. So that just is only going to get extended if there's no investment on the technology side, right? Salespeople should not be quoting pricing necessarily unless it's more strategic to a shipper. But if you even extend that even further down the supply chain, right? So sourcing, manufacturing, product development has been heavily relying on factory visits, which aren't going to happen for a long time. And so now the question is, when I was on the forwarder side, we did a lot of, we're trying to eliminate samples and stuff like that. But, there's always this argument from people that, oh, well, they need to really hold the shoe and touch the leather. But the new world is they might not be able to, quite frankly. And I know it is important in the brown shoe industry, and it's a lot for lots of products. But early on development, getting feedback from customers, the only way you're going to be able to do that if you can really digitize your samples. And so for me, that's only a couple aspects, but really in the end of the day is from the board level, they need to really hyper focus where their resources are being spent. I mean, you can't, it's not enough to just say, hey, we're going to invest in technology. I think you really need to think about the pain points that your customers are facing.
So true. Martyn, this one back to you. What other factors would be important? What other factors will be important for logistics in the future? How will the focus on sustainability be adopted by an industry that's so heavy on emissions?
Well, I do think that sustainability will be tremendously important for the logistics in the future. I'm a little bit of a skeptic. I think a lot of it so far has been driven by corporate social or shareholder mandated corporate social responsibility, and showing businesses are actually doing something in terms of sustainability. I think thus far also the biggest impact has been made by governments, and the IMO particularly, and European Union and others putting in place restrictions, right? Low sulfur fuel zones, low emission zones, and that kind of stuff. What I hope, will be that people carry that on down the line, and that they'll look for solutions that are, that are going to be more sustainable going forward. Maybe different modalities are sometimes the solution, or something that's we always thought that's very time sensitive, that we're there for shipping by air, maybe not as time sensitive, and maybe going by train between Europe and the US or in Asia is somehow a solution. And these are all things that can come into play.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo pretty much what Martyn said. I think at the end of the day, the question is not whether people want to do it. Both sides want to do it. I think the question is who's going to pay for it, and that's a heated argument right now. You're seeing exactly the green versus the cost situation, which plays out throughout the world constantly in politics and everything. But I think it has to happen. It's just a question of how. So there's low sulfur fuel, the different types of scrubbers. But is this cost going to be passed along, or is it going to be absorbed in an industry? And I don't know if it's too different than many other industries, but there's not much transparency on cost structure, right? So there's always been this kind of zero-sum game between BCO shippers and carriers and forwarders, maybe less so about forwarders, but is that a cost that the shippers should pay? And maybe it is. I don't even know what the answer is to that, but I think that the industry, generally speaking, is going in the right direction. And one of the most important, I think, was just publishing the CO2 emissions data. I think was a good step in the right direction. So you have kind of a baseline on the improvements that are being made. But I think everyone's committed to it. It's just a question about execution.
Great. Another question for our audience. These digital solutions are attractive, for small companies with tight budgets. What is the average savings for companies who use these services versus a traditional direct relationship?
Yeah, I think it depends how you look at it, right? So if you're talking about our marketplace approach, it could just getting rates and booking shipments. It could be anywhere between 10 and 20%. Depends on your business, right? Larger companies are a lot more aggressive on their pricing, but the question was more related to small to medium. So I mean, we've been all the way up to much more like 40%. Sometimes there is a lot of it, and this is the question about a good forwarder versus not a forwarder not necessarily doing the right thing, and that's not every case. But if we look on the freight forwarder side on some of our other software, we mostly target SMB forwarders as well for the most part. But we know it costs $20 to $30 to manually quote a customer, and that's per quote basically. So if you're doing a lot of them and you've got like a 10% award rate, you can tell it becomes highly expensive, right? So generally speaking, we charge like cents or whatever per quote. So you have a hard ROI right there off the bat. And I would think even more probably intangible is some of the stuff that we do with Qwyk, which is, you don't just have hard savings, you have a kind of a whole ecosystem to manage your customers. So I think on the digital transformation, there's really like this two-pronged approach, right? So one is, hey, you got hard cost savings here, but hey, we really know our customers want this because they're telling us it. So, I don't know what the cost of losing a customer necessarily is, but I'm sure it's a lot more expensive than hosting or licensing monthly software, basically.
And it's not just on the cost side. I mean, not only savings come into play in terms of monetary savings, a lot more fuzzy to quantify, but still important is how are your people using their time? If you've got sometimes expensive salespeople sitting there spending 60% of their time doing repetitive tasks, or customer service or operational people, answering phones or emails about what a cargo status is. Those people could be getting you new business, and actually growing the business, rather than simply looking at what am I save and how many staff can I get rid of. You could say, okay, what I'm going to gain if I can get these people to devote their time to maybe do project cargo or finding new opportunities in the market that exists. And even on the very, it's not just SMBs. I mean, I've heard people from one of the largest shipping lines in the world speak about this. They went in the Middle East and India, I think, to doing about 90% of their quotes online. And they're picking the fruits from those people now going out and doing more project cargo and things that are generally more profitable to them than your fatal kind containers.
Thank you. I think this leads us right into our next question. And you are new and disruptive to the traditional shipping industry. This brings many challenges. How do you manage and address these? Cory, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of noise in startups, right? And I think that creates one of the many challenges we already have in startup world is how to launch a business and how to grow it. But now you've got this other added challenge for us, generally speaking, is how to make it clear on exactly what we do, because there's competitors out there that are quote unquote digital forwarder startups that are competing with our customer base, right? Directly. And we don't. So neither of us are freight forwarders. We don't move freight. We create technology for the industry. So actually, generally speaking, we love this question when it comes up because, we have two customers, really. It's pretty simple, shippers and forwarders for the most part. And so for us, what we're really doing is we're really bringing the technology that used to cost, some of these companies millions and millions of dollars to invest in and keep developing on. We bring it down to basically nothing when all is said and done. So really, we're more kind of helping these guys out and helping them leverage the technology basically to move into the e-com/digital arena, I guess.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I'd almost say that we're almost the antithesis of the disruptive startup as people normally understand it, right? Like Cory said, we don't compete with anybody, particularly in the freight forwarding business, in the business that we're trying to help. And a lot of times we go out to customers and we say, hey, you've got these disruptive startups, but the world can, need you guys still be better at doing things digital, and we're going to help you compete with them, right? Compete with these disruptive startups. So in some sense, we're at some parts opposed to them. That brings tensions in itself. I mean, as Cory already said, how do you explain it to people? And sometimes we get the question, do you actually, well, when I move my cargo through your platform, what is that going to mean for me? Are you going to put me out of business at some point? I currently don't have any intention to move cargo myself.
I mean, honestly, maybe this is probably a good opportunity, right? So there's the Uber Freights of the world. There's Convoys, there's Flexports, Transfix, a lot of them. These guys are brokers, so they're not marketplaces. They negotiate rates with carriers and they resell them. They're using technology to do that and be more efficient. But let's be they're competing with other brokers and stuff like that on the trucking side, or forwarders for Flexport. So we don't actually move freight. We don't negotiate rates. We don't do any of that. We literally just create technology for the industry.
Makes sense. So my next question is, recently carriers announced good profits, but this seems to be mainly because of the drop in oil prices. You're directly working with rate management. Do you think carriers in different modes are following smart strategies when it comes to pricing? Or you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so it's a good question, also kind of a touchy subject for various reasons. But I think, if I'm being completely as candid as I can be, I think that the pricing now is a little bit detached from what I feel is reality. So we've seen on the Asia to US side, we've seen like 6x on air freight. So pre-COVID, we're at like 3. We've gone up to close to 20. Now we're back down to around 10. And that's being driven by, iPhone launch and stuff like that. On the ocean side, we've seen from, China to the West Coast, 3x in pricing. And so that it's kind of a confusing thing, right? Because that doesn't necessarily follow a pragmatic approach to pricing. That being said, are they doing a good job? I mean, it's hard to argue no for that, right? So they've increased their profits and held their pricing. I think it's tough on the shipper side, and usually when this happens historically, there's what I mentioned with zero-sum game. So when COVID goes away and the tables have turned, you'll see the shippers beat up the carriers again. So I mean, for me, have they done a good job? Yes. That being said, they've been warned by both China and US governments about their pricing. So I think that speaks volumes. And so, I don't know. At some point, I'd like to see this kind of go away between the battle of the zero-sum game and kind of make it a little bit more cooperative, I guess, per se. But generally speaking, the answer is yes, they've done a good job.
Great.
I think, recalling back in, I think 2013, 2014, maybe 15, at some point, you're paying $200 for a 20-foot container from Shanghai to Rotterdam, right? And those prices are completely unsustainable. I think what has happened is that they've seen, okay, it's going to be sink or swim, literally and figuratively, for ocean carriers at least. Yep. Right now with this COVID crisis, we're going to have to put our foot down. And if you think about it conceptually, how much cargo are these carriers moving, and how dependent are consumers on them, how dependent are globalized businesses on them, you'd expect them to make a profit. It doesn't have to be a very high one, and whatever that number is up for debate.
Right.
But we need those carriers, right? And we also need people to want to invest in the logistics businesses and in carriers and that kind of stuff to keep growing it, because in a globalized environment, what else are you going to do? You're going to keep needing them in the future. So I don't think it's necessarily bad if a carrier turns a good profit. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But they've managed it, right? And they've been taking the opportunity to re-index at some point. I'd say that's smart to some extent.
Yeah, I think the question at the end of the day is, what should the price be? And I don't think we actually know that. And so then it's hard to argue either way. But obviously, look, it's going to eat into shippers' profits. So I don't think there's any argument there either. So I think from a consumer's perspective, it's kind of interesting. And when I say that, is that price usually gets passed along, or sometimes it gets eaten. So we'll see what the brands choose to do. But generally speaking, that could mean more expensive stuff for us.
Great. We just had a great question from our audience. How will blockchain influence your digital solutions? And either of you can take that.
Mark, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to blockchain. I think it's been, quite overhyped over the past couple of years, but it's an interesting thing to start a topic about databases and how we exchange data and how we make sure between different business that the data is secure. For us, we haven't really been touching it that much or at all, because what we do is quite simple, right? We host a database for one business. There's not really a lot of stuff going between different businesses. We're not very much a transactional based company. Um, you know, so from our side, it doesn't influence it heavily. I think there's great opportunities, and there's smart people working on ideas and solutions using those technology. On the other hand, I'm a technical guy. I'm thinking, well, we've had distributed databases for like God knows how long now, right? Um, but it's always interesting to see sort of a new technology come up and people really grasping, taking a hold of that and running with it and finding like a lot of enthusiasm around it, right? In terms of finding new solutions. I think in that sense, it's always good.
Yeah, I mean, so it's obviously one of the most hyped up and discussed, and I don't mean necessarily in a bad way, but discussed topics in supply chain, generally speaking. I think the important part for me is that you always want to pick the right technology for the solution, that and the easiest technology really at the end of the day, because that drives cost. But I think the companies, and the reason I laughed actually originally when we were talking about it is not because it's a funny question, but because a lot of companies, a lot of startups seem to just label blockchain on something, right? And in reality, it's not a solution in my mind to, generally speaking, supply chain. And that's, I've asked some very large companies that have adopted this, and they don't necessarily have a good answer for it. They say, oh, it helps with documents and the bill of lading and stuff like that. Well, quite frankly, you can do the same thing on a platform, the way that solves that same challenge without using blockchain. So to me, if that's the case, then for me, you don't use blockchain. That being said, I've seen some really good use cases for blockchain, and one of them being letter of credit. So a lot of the probably people on this webinar right now are very familiar with the letter of credit process, and it sucks, right? So you've got this bank that's really holding up the whole process, and it's expensive. So blockchain is a great example of when you can just take that bank out of the equation and issue letters of credit on the blockchain. And so I think that's the way I would look at it, is very, and by the way, that's not niche, but I'm going to call it niche in the grand scheme of stuff because it's big business. But I think that's the right approach to take it. It's not a boil the ocean type deal where you say, okay, well, I'm going to implement blockchain. Now my software is just solving all the supply chain stuff. And it's just not the case. So I think it's more very unique targeted use cases.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I got to echo that. I mean, there's a couple of solutions out there also to do with documents and compliance, which are very important. And I think a critical part about the blockchain is it's immutable, right? It can be modified once it's set there, unless 51% of the network agrees with a modification. If I store something in a database, I can go in and change that date in a traditional one, right? With blockchain, that's not possible. If you're dealing with stuff like hazardous cargo, where you've got to have like documents and a quite important audit trail, at the point something's gone wrong, you can prove exactly what the state of a set of documentation or an audit trail was at a specific point in time. And for those solutions, it's helpful. Those are not solutions we're particularly working on at this moment. There's other very interesting startups working on this stuff.
Right. Our next question is, a really actually important question, is basic, but because I know this, we've all been affected by, getting paper goods, paper towel, toilet paper. How should companies respond in times such as these to keep their goods moving to the market? If they heavily rely on one means, ocean, land, or air. Martyn?
I think keeping yourself differentiated. We're seeing, I think, especially on the carrier side, but freight forwarders are getting a little bit towards that as well. It's a consolidated market, and it can be lucrative and interesting to put all your eggs in one basket, be it with the one that gives you the best price. But if they can deliver or they can meet your capacity requirements, or a crisis like this happens, you're host. So you want to kind of hedge your bets and make sure you've got those alternatives and maybe even capacity reserved with somebody else. And there's alternative modalities. I mentioned earlier something that's been quite successful, especially over the past couple of months. But even the past couple of years is sort of the real service that's now going on between Asia, ports in China, and Eastern Europe. And especially when air was impacted earlier this year, you saw a significant increase in that modality because it's a lot faster than ocean, right? It's not as fast as air, but it's still significantly faster. Oil is sort of looked at as a premium product. It's just sort of in between the ocean and the airspace. So that's one thing you can do.
Great.
Look at all the alternative modalities and make sure you're hedging your bets in terms of who you're working with.
Great.
Yeah, so it depends on the company that we're talking about, right? But and how they do business. I mean, generally speaking, I mean, this goes back to risk management ahead of the curve, but we're already there, so I don't think there's any reason for me to keep talking about that. But I think generally speaking, you have to be ready to pay more. So we know that there's going to be a capacity crunch. We know that generally speaking, the carriers have held their prices and don't seem to budge because I see GRI announcements left and right. So I mean, to me, it's going to be the ability to move your products, and the price is going to be secondary now. Is can I get space? And you know, generally speaking, for the most part, the carriers want to fill the vessels or fill the flights with the highest paying stuff or products, meaning the shipper that's paying more. And so, you know, that's how I look at it. And it's going to be unfortunate, but it's something that they're going to have to deal with from a BCO shipper perspective for, you know, probably at least another year.
Yeah, great information. You recently started onboarding a freight forwarding network with 85 SME members. These companies jointly did a major step during a global crisis. What can other companies learn from that? Martyn, want to start with that?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, it's important to recognize that that specific group had already decided to go down this road before COVID hit. So they were already planning to execute a product or project like this and become more digitized. On the flip side of that is that initially their scope was quite a bit smaller. So there's a network of companies that all work together to move stuff around the world, and they're basically agents of each other. I think the initial scope was for them to quote internally. Once this hit, they did not let that deter from going ahead with this project, which is obviously great, right? They saw the opportunity to continue with it and figured, well, anytime but the present, right? And second, they expanded that scope to include servicing customers and then having online platforms for the customers that they can go and do quotes on, create bookings on, track their cargo on, and what have you. So I think that's a key takeaway. I mean, continue looking sort of at the situation and that's going on. And even in a pandemic, you know, your assessment may be, well, as good as time as any.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Cory?
Yeah, I think so it's interesting. I think forwarder networks are a little bit unique in this way, although every forwarder naturally has to do this in some way or another. They don't all have rates for every lane, and they don't have offices around the world. Even the large, you know, forwarders don't have offices all around the world. So you got to rely on other offices and forwarders to get rates from them, right? And so what I think they've done a great job of doing is saying, okay, well, when I'm trying to get a rate from another forwarder in another network, what's that experience like? And, you know, what happens after that? How do I interact with the customers and stuff like that? And so it's interesting because if a forwarder is trying to get a rate from another forwarder, guess what? A shipper is trying to get a rate from you. That caused that whole scenario. So that shipper, your customer, is experiencing, you know, 10 times worse what you're experiencing. So I think, you know, that's really what brought up this project was like, okay, well, we know it sucks for us. It's going to suck for our customers. And that's not, why would you keep that process going? So I think that's a way to like kind of look at things critically and impartially. And, you know, it's tough to kind of look, you know, intrinsically like that or internally. But, and then I think the other part of that is you don't need to be a software expert to launch these projects, right? We've got a whole team that supports the whole thing. So, you know, to me, you don't need to know exactly what you want. You do need to know, you know, what your goal is, right? What the end customer or end goal for the customer is. And then we can help you with the rest of that. So I think, and that's not necessarily just, you know, I'm not saying just our companies can do that. A lot of SaaS companies have great people. So the point at the end of the day is like, don't make it so terrifying. And I think a pandemic actually made it you know, a little bit easier on the forwarders to do this type of stuff because, you know, the sales teams and stuff like that aren't traveling as much. People have a little bit of more time to concentrate on projects like this and think critically. So interesting times. And I think, you know, it's been interesting for us too, because on the inbound side, you know, we've got a lot more interest in it. And so I think you've now reached a pinnacle in logistics where the transformation is going to take place.
Yeah, so true.
And even those goals can even be fluid, right? I mean, you know, we see some companies embarking on a digitization project or starting to build new stuff, and that can take quite a bit of time. But the world doesn't stop, you know, just because you're digitizing or building a new product, right? So keep considering that as well. What is the current situation? What are people looking for now? What is important to them now? Because you don't want to come out at the other end of a $1 million project that has taken you 2 years and then find out that reality is caught up.
Yeah.
It is so true, so true. And this leads me right into my next question. As you both have expertly explained, businesses must continue to pivot and evolve during this challenging time. Any other trends that we may see in the next year?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's not going to stop, and the conversation is going to be all around COVID. I mean, for a long time from now, and unfortunately, that means that I think companies will also have to look critically at their business. I mean, we all know this might very well mean a lot of businesses are going to go out of business, generally speaking, right? Especially on the retail side. There's no stopping that. I think you're going to see a remodeling of consumer activity for sure. But generally speaking, I think BCOs from a shipper's perspective will probably obviously think critically about their business lines, but like products, stuff like this that, you know, typically speaking, at least in my experience, when we've done very heavy on the development side. So, right, you start with like 1,000 SKUs and you try to get down to like 200. Well, I think these are costs that are very serious conversations that need to take place. So you're going to see smaller offerings, less products available to people, I think, less potentially creativity for a little bit as well. So I think you're going to see a lot of remodeling. And then on the shipper side, you know, in terms of like shipping freight, there's going to be that capacity crunch. And I'm going to be looking into the RFP season that we're going to come through in the spring with higher pricing. I'm interested in seeing what the carriers do that might be new in their contracts. So we know that they declared force majeure on their last contracts for a lot of their shippers, which means they just said, oh, well, the contracts are null and void, at least temporarily. So I'm wondering what kind of wordage will be put into the contracts, or it might stay the same. But I do predict that they're going to be paying significantly higher prices, and that's going to be tough because that sets the rest of the year up, right? So the carriers will most likely maintain that pricing.
True.
I think the focus is going to be largely economical, right? You know, once those sort of government stimulus efforts stop, which they will at some point. I mean, governments can't continue spending at the rate they're spending right now. You're going to see a lot of defaults and you know, a lot of people going into debt, and that's going to sort of set the tone, I think, for a large part of 2021. I'm not positive as a whole in the economy whatsoever in that sense. I will continue being about COVID. I mean, you know, maybe there's a vaccine in 2 months. Even if that's true, and bar all the problems with logistics that we talked about earlier, I mean, that capacity can be ramped up from 0 to 7 billion people from one day to the other, right? So it's not just the supply chain part of this, but it's also the production part of this that's going to take time to get all sorted. So I think, you know, people will start sort of, you'll start seeing a line. People are going to be buttoning down in some respects and expecting poor economic weather. And others going to be taking on extra risk, you know, figuring out where they can make an opportunity out of this. And it's kind of, you know, one thing or another, it's going to be very interesting.
I mean, I think on the distribution side, another thing that we didn't talk about was like, obviously distributing the vaccine, but, you know, I don't know if everyone here in the US at least remember we had a meat shortage for a little bit, right? Because of distribution of meat. So, I mean, that's kind of what I know this is a little bit off topic, but this is what I'm looking into in 2021 is how COVID comes back in the fall and the winter and what the impact is. Because let's face it, if we have distribution issues on certain stuff, it's going to become a very significant issue. And we only face it short term, really, for the most part. So I think it's going to be a little bit, I hate to be down and out, but it's a little troublesome to me, I think.
Yeah, so important to talk about this. kind of to wrap up, any final takeaways for our audience? What else, can you offer them in terms of, a winning logistics strategy for this new paradigm?
I mean, it's kind of, have to be a large amount of flexibility and a lot of focus. If you're a logistics provider, and I come from that part of the business, so I can mostly speak towards that, a large focus on figuring out what your customer wants and how you can best serve their needs. Because that's what's going to differentiate you in the end. I think a lot of the logistics is becoming more commercialized, if you will. So it's going to be a B2B business forever. But a lot of people are sort of pulling more of commercial experience into it, and they want to have the same experience that they get when they're ordering food online or what have you, if they place that booking. So that will be something for people to focus on and to think about and sort of get a slightly different cap on. It's important to take into account.
Yeah, I would basically echo Martyn. So obviously there's a couple major things, and one is flexibility, obviously risk management that we've talked about, but also the other is flexibility. And I think that can be carried on throughout the whole supply chain. But the question at the end of the day is, for me anyway, is, okay, when do they take a step back and critically look at their business and say, look, this is where we could have done better. Like I said, risk management is on everyone's minds, but it kind of falls behind price and saving money and even delivering goods in normal times better. But the question for me is, how do you pop up nearshoring options for manufacturing? How do you dual develop products or triple or whatever it is? What are the costs associated with that? But if we talk about flexibility, like now what can be done? And I think the question is, no doubt about it, and you probably won't hear this from very many people in a talk like this, but I generally think forwarders are going to play an even more important part going forward. If we talk about risk management, you don't necessarily want to contract directly with carriers. I mean, to me, I've spent a lot of my career in that side of the business, and there's a lot of benefits to both sides for sure, but price can be, generally speaking, fairly close in many cases. So there's stuff like that. Like, how do you think about it from a risk management perspective, and then manufacturing, and you slide that down and just say, look, there really needs to be more like an agile risk management plan, and someone needs to sit down and say, we're going to come to terms with this, and this is how we're gonna operate in the future in 2021. And I don't think it goes away, to be honest with you. I think COVID just brought it to light more, and I think in the future we'll see those implemented, hopefully, and flexibility become one of the more key important things in terms of getting products to consumers.
So true. Thank you both. This is such a great conversation that will continue, I'm sure. And I want to thank you both on behalf of the World Trade Center Boston and WebPort Global for joining us today, and for sharing your vision on how you be innovative and become front runners in the new digitized supply chain. Also, a big thank you to our audience for tuning in to our fireside chat today. If you want to continue this conversation with our experts, please visit their website posted on the message box, and check out WebPort Global's social media channels for upcoming events, including our two-part series, Selling into the EU with HubSpot and Titan Solutions. I want to tell everybody, please be safe and well, and thank you again for joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you soon.